Othre told his lord, King Alfred, that he lived farther north than any other Norwegian. He said that he lived in the north of the country beside the West Sea. He said that the land stretches a long way north from there, however, though it is completely unpopulated, except for a few places here and there where Sami live, hunting in winter and fishing by sea in the summer. He said that on one occasion he wanted to find out how far north the land stretched, and whether anyone lived to the north of the wilderness area. Othre, or rather Götar, was a Norse merchant from Hålogaland, the region around the Norwegian Islands, who apparently visited King Alfred's court in the 880s, that being the kingdom of Wessex in southeast England, for those who are unfamiliar. Bearing walrus teeth for the king, Götar had sailed from beyond the veil of the Arctic Circle to trade with the English. In his words, though filtered through the quills of Old English scribes, his home was very long and very narrow. All the land that can be grazed or plowed lies beside the sea, and even that is very rocky in places. Above and to the east lie wild, mountainous wastelands, stretching all along the length of the inhabited land. Sami inhabit the wasteland. For Götar, his version of the north was on the fringe of the Norse world, which was bordered somewhat threateningly by the mountainous wastelands of the Sami. Almost, one could say, like the Norse gods of Asgard and the frost giants of Jotunheim, if you're familiar with Norse mythology. I've mentioned the Sami a few times now, but who were they? They certainly weren't Norse, and yet Götar frequently mentions them, telling King Alfred's court how much they valued, quote, decoy reindeer, paid his people, the Norse of Hålogaland, tribute, and how they occasionally raided each other's land. Götar describes them as being divided by geography itself, and yet their people interact like flowing water that, from time to time, swirls violently. Götar's experience is only a small, localized glimpse of the North, but his themes remain true for this entire lesson. The environment of the North is what made the Norse Norse, and it also governed their interactions with other cultures shaped by the other regions of the North. Yet, we shouldn't be fooled into believing that the Norse themselves were all the same either, for the experience of Götar, a Norwegian from the far north, was somewhat different than someone in southern Denmark, for example. To make things as simple and concise as possible, we'll try to discuss the North one region at a time, starting with Götar's North, Norway. The first group we'll be considering were the Northmen. You might have heard this term and seen it used on the internet to refer to all medieval Scandinavians, but it mostly applied to those living in, or coming from, the region of modern-day Norway. Back then, however, this region was probably called Norðvegur, meaning North Way in Old Norse, which refers to the sheltered sea route along Norway's western coastline. To explain, inland travel was difficult in Norway because much of its landscape is mountainous and deeply indented by fjords. But sea travel was much easier because numerous coastal islands create sheltered channels for ships to travel through quickly and safely. This feature was a lifeline for those living in this region, who used it for both travel and trade, so it's not surprising that their home was named after it, and that their own identities were shaped by it. This is also one reason why the Northmen were, like other Norse, so skilled in seafaring and shipbuilding. Despite their inland hardships, though, the climate of Norway was surprisingly mild. This was largely thanks to something called the Gulf Stream, which still brings warm waters from the Gulf of Mexico up to the western coastline of Norway as far north as the Norwegian Islands, which is where Götar hailed from. Yet, while still helping keep Norwegian winters less severe, that still wasn't enough to bless their land with much arable land, that is, land suitable for farming. Only two regions had significant amounts of arable land, the areas around Trondheim and Oslo. This, along with rugged terrain, not only forced settlements in Norway to be dispersed, that is, isolated farmsteads rather than villages, but also divided power between those two regions. These conditions also meant that most Northmen relied on animal husbandry for survival, which involved raising livestock, mostly cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, and making dairy products and other goods with them. These animals were so important, in fact, that a person's social status was frequently determined by how many animals they had. For an example, consider how this source speaks of Götar's reputation. Quote, "He was a very well-to-do man, rich in the possessions which comprised their wealth, namely wild beasts. He was one of the most prominent men in that land, Hålogaland, yet he had no more than 20 cattle, 20 sheep, and 20 pigs, and the little that he plowed with horses." Even their southerly neighbors, the Danir, or Danes, valued livestock quite highly, but they certainly weren't as bound to them for survival. Despite living in the smallest part of Scandinavia, their region had the highest portion of arable land among the Norse. Indeed, it was because of that large amount of arable land that the Danir became the wealthiest, most numerous, and most politically dominant group of the Norse during the Viking Age, which was roughly from 750 to 1050. So when they weren't busy occupying parts of modern-day Norway and Sweden, the Danir gathered in small villages to the south and busied themselves with farming. Their main crops were barley, rye, oats, peas, beans, and cabbage, and they may have even produced surplus grain at some times. These crops would have been grown by any other Norse farm that sat on arable land in the north, but the Danir certainly had extra favorable conditions when compared to their northern kin, at least. The Danir weren't just a bunch of landlubbers with some nice dirt, though. Their region was primarily a peninsula, but it also included over 400 scattered islands. This meant that, like their Northman kin to the north, they too were intimately familiar with shipbuilding and seamanship, and they were quite active on the sea, too. Their position and prosperity in the north made them the gatekeepers to the Baltic Sea. This close connection to the sea also encouraged the scattered islands of this region to develop close cultural links long before the Viking Age. This coalescence is supported by both linguistic and archaeological evidence, including the use of the word Dani by Latin sources, such as Jordanes Getica, and artifacts suggesting that there was a shared regional identity forming here early on. Unlike the Danir, however, the Norse of modern-day Sweden remained a bit more divided, enough so that I must include two names for the people of this region: the Götar and the Svíar. These two groups seem to have had a close relationship, with some Svíar kings being of Götar origin, and yet they remained politically divided until the 12th century, though they were unified for a short time before then, it seems, under King Olaf Skotkonungur between 995 and 1020. As far as the Götar are concerned, though, we unfortunately don't know much about them, possibly due to confusion over identities in written records. The Svíar, on the other hand, have several well-known historical sites to flex: Gamla Uppsala, which was a major pagan cult center, the pre-Viking Age burials of both Vendel and Valsgard, which contained lavish ships and armor, and Viking Age towns like Burka, where the famous woman warrior burial, BJ 581, hails from. You're guaranteed to hear more about those sites from this course later on. Agriculturally speaking, though, both the Götar and the Svíar had a fair amount of arable land to work with, mostly around their large inland lakes and eastern coastline. Much of the landscape was covered in dense forests, so rivers and lakes offered them the best routes for inland travel, meaning that they, too, relied heavily on ships and sailing for survival. Both groups were undoubtedly active in the Baltic Sea as well, but Svíar kings, in particular, collected tribute from Finnish areas to the east of the Baltic. It's also not surprising that, given their position in the north, The Vikingar of this region were mostly active in the east, especially in regions like Russia and even further, Byzantium.